In 1888, 17 miners descended into the copper shafts beneath Roros and never returned. Their lanterns were found days later, still burning, arranged in a perfect circle around an ancient runic stone that predates the town by 1,000 years. Local Sami whisper of the Fossagrim, the waterfall spirit who claims souls through song, but the truth buried in those frozen depths is far more terrifying. Tonight, follow Björn Eriksson, a mining engineer who ignored every warning, every grandmother's tale, every priest's blessing, as he ventured into those cursed tunnels in 1923. What he discovered in the echoing darkness will chill your blood and haunt your dreams. Close your eyes. Let the Norwegian wind carry you into the depths, and prepare to uncover a secret so ancient that even the northern lights dim in its presence. But beware. Some who listen to this tale report hearing the distant sound of pickaxes long after the story ends. The winter of 1923 settled over Roros like a burial shroud, thick and suffocating in its silence. In this remote corner of central Norway, where the copper mines had carved their scars into the earth for centuries, the wind spoke in languages older than memory. It whispered through the wooden buildings that lined the cobblestone streets, their timber walls darkened by decades of smelter smoke and Arctic frost. Roros stood as a testament to human ambition carved from the unforgiving wilderness. Founded in 1644, when copper ore was discovered beneath the frozen ground, the town had grown around the promise of wealth buried deep in the earth. The Roros copper works had made men rich and broken just as many, but it was the stories, the dark tales that old miners shared in hushed voices over their evening ale, that truly defined this place. The mining museum, housed in the old smelter building, displayed the tools and testimonies of generations of workers who had descended into those tunnels. But what it didn't display, what the official records carefully omitted, were the accounts of the 17 men who vanished in the winter of 1888. Their names were carved into no memorial stone, their fate recorded in no official document. Yet, their story lived on in the memories of the Sami herders, in the warnings of village elders, in the way certain shafts were permanently sealed with no explanation given. The Sami people who had wandered these lands long before the first copper vein was exposed spoke of joik, traditional songs that carried the essence of the land itself. They sang of the Fossagrim, the fiddle-playing spirit who dwelt beneath waterfalls and lured the unwary to their doom with melodies too beautiful for mortal ears. But in Roros, their songs carried darker verses, whispers of something that slept beneath the copper veins, something that the old Norse settlers had encountered and feared enough to carve protective runes into the very stones they used to line their mine shafts. The town's wooden church, its dark timber spire piercing the gray winter sky, bore runic inscriptions that scholars claimed were decorative. Local folklore suggested otherwise. The symbols, barely visible after centuries of weathering, were said to be protective wards against whatever dwelt in the depths below. Father Olsen, who had ministered to the mining families for 30 years, never spoke directly of these inscriptions, but he was known to cross himself whenever passing certain sealed mine entrances. In the winter months, when the aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of green and gold, the old-timers claimed you could hear sounds rising from the abandoned shafts. Not the settling of timber or the drip of groundwater, but something else entirely. A rhythmic tapping, like pickaxes striking stone, accompanied by what sounded almost like singing. The local constabulary had investigated these reports multiple times, finding nothing but empty tunnels and the echo of their own footsteps. The landscape itself seemed to hold its breath around Roros. The surrounding hills, covered in sparse pine and birch, rolled away towards the Swedish border in waves of white and gray. Frozen streams wound between the trees like silver threads, their surfaces thick with ice that reflected the pale winter sun. In this vastness, the mining town appeared almost insignificant, a small human endeavor dwarfed by the ancient stones and endless sky. Yet beneath this serene surface, the earth was honeycombed with tunnels. 3 centuries of mining had created a labyrinth that extended deep into the bedrock, following copper veins that twisted and branched like the roots of some massive underground tree. The older shafts, those dating back to the earliest days of the mining operation, descended furthest, into the darkness. It was in these forgotten depths that the 17 miners had made their final, fatal discovery. The official investigation, conducted by mining engineers from Trondheim, concluded that a collapse had sealed the men in a side tunnel. Their bodies, it was assumed, lay beneath tons of fallen rock and would remain there as a permanent memorial to the dangers of their profession. The mine owners, reluctant to risk further lives in a rescue attempt that seemed hopeless, ordered the affected section permanently sealed. But the miners who had worked alongside the missing men told different stories. They spoke of strange discoveries in the weeks before the disappearance, ancient timbers that predated the mine by centuries, stone carvings that hurt the eyes to look upon, and a chamber that seemed to extend far beyond what their lantern light could penetrate. Most disturbing of all were the sounds that had begun emanating from the deeper tunnels, sounds that seemed almost musical, almost human, but not quite either. The Roros copper works attempted to maintain normal operations, but workers increasingly refused assignments to the deeper shafts. Production declined, and by 1900, many of the older tunnels had been abandoned entirely. The company focused its efforts on the newer, shallower workings, leaving the deeper maze of passages to the darkness and whatever inhabited them. Local children were warned away from the sealed entrances, but the curious and the brave still sometimes ventured close. They reported hearing things that made them flee, not the expected sounds of abandonment, but something that suggested the mines were far from empty. Parents began telling stories of the Bergtak, mountain spirits, who claimed the souls of those who disturbed their domain, and the old Sami warnings took on new urgency. As the years passed, Roros adapted to life above ground, while below, in the forgotten depths, something waited in patient silence. The copper veins that had drawn men to this remote corner of Norway had served their purpose, bringing wealth and prosperity to the surface world. But they had also provided pathways into depths that perhaps should have remained undisturbed, connections to chambers and caverns that existed long before the first human footstep marked the frozen ground. Above, the winter wind continued to sing through the streets of Roros, carrying with it the whispers of old stories and older fears. In the darkness of the polar night, when the aurora borealis danced overhead and cast strange shadows on the snow, the town seemed to huddle closer together, as if seeking protection from something that lurked just beyond the reach of lamplight and fireplace warmth. It was into this atmosphere of half-remembered fears and carefully unspoken warnings that Björn Eriksson arrived in the winter of 1923, carrying with him the confidence of modern engineering and the arrogance of a man who had never learned to listen to the wind. The train from Oslo wheezed to a stop at Roros station with a hiss of steam that seemed almost alive in the frigid air. Björn Eriksson gathered his leather satchel and surveyed the platform through the frosted window of his compartment. Snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, each one catching the yellow glow of the station lamps and transforming the mundane scene into something that belonged in a fairy tale, though whether it was the kind that ended happily was another matter entirely. Björn was 34 years old, tall and lean, with the precise movements of a man accustomed to calculations and measurements. His education at the Norwegian Institute of Technology in Trondheim had filled his mind with modern mining techniques, geological surveys, and the rational explanations that the 20th century offered for phenomena that previous generations had attributed to supernatural causes. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a professional who had solved problems in mines from the Arctic Circle to the copper workings of South America. The Roros Mining Consortium had hired him to conduct a feasibility study of the abandoned deeper workings. Recent fluctuations in copper prices had made previously unprofitable deposits worth reconsidering, and Björn's reputation for extracting value from exhausted mines had preceded him to this remote corner of Norway. His brief was straightforward: determine whether modern mining techniques could safely access the sealed lower levels and estimate the potential yield from resumed operations. As he stepped onto the platform, the cold struck him like a physical blow. The air was so crisp it seemed to crystallize in his lungs, and his breath formed clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry atmosphere. The station master, a grizzled man whose face bore the weathered lines of decades spent in the Norwegian winter, approached with the measured gait of someone who had learned not to hurry in such conditions. "Mr. Eriksson," The man's voice carried the distinctive accent of the Trøndelag region, vowels stretched and consonants softened by generations of isolation. "I'm Lars Haugen. The consortium sent word you'd be arriving on the evening train." Björn nodded, adjusting his wool coat against the wind. "Indeed. I trust accommodation has been arranged?" "Aye, the Bergman's boarding house. Clean rooms, good food, and Astrid Bergman knows how to keep a fire burning through the night. You'll need that. Winter's been particularly fierce this year." Lars gestured towards a horse-drawn sledge waiting near the station entrance. "The mines are just outside town, but I imagine you'll want to settle in first, get your bearings." As they loaded Björn's luggage onto the sledge, he couldn't help but notice the way Lars's eyes avoided certain directions, how his gaze seemed to skitter away from the dark line of hills that rose beyond the town's western edge. It was a subtle thing, the kind of detail that a less observant man might have missed, but Björn had spent years reading the unspoken communications of miners and local guides. Fear had its own body language, and Lars Haugen wore it like an uncomfortable coat. The journey through Roros's cobblestone streets provided Björn with his first real sense of the town's character. The wooden buildings, painted in deep reds and yellows that seemed almost defiant against the monochrome winter landscape, lined narrow streets that had been carved out according to no grand plan, but rather the practical needs of a community built around a single industry. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, creating a gray haze that softened the harsh edges of the Arctic night. "Been mining engineer long?" Lars asked, his voice carefully casual as they passed a cluster of older buildings near what appeared to be the town center. "Nearly 15 years, Björn replied. "Started in the coal mines near Drammen, then worked copper in Sweden before taking positions overseas. The consortium mentioned some unique challenges with the Roros workings." Lars was quiet for a long moment, the only sounds the clip-clop of the horses' hooves on cobblestone and the whisper of sledge runners cutting through packed snow. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "Unique. Aye, that's one word for it." He paused, seeming to wrestle with himself. "You seem like a practical man, Mr. Eriksson. Educated, not one for old wives' tales and such." "I prefer facts to folklore, if that's what you're asking." "Good, good." But Lars didn't sound entirely convinced. Well, you'll hear stories. Town like this, isolated as we are, stories have a way of growing in the telling. But there are some things, some places, that might be worth taking seriously, even for a practical man. Before Björn could press for details, the sledge drew up before a substantial timber building with warm light spilling from its windows. A carved wooden sign above the door proclaimed it the Bergman's establishment, and the smell of cooking meat and burning pine logs promised welcome relief from the bitter cold. Astrid Bergman proved to be a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair braided severely back and eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. She greeted Björn with professional courtesy, showing him to a room on the second floor that was spartanly furnished but scrupulously clean. A fire crackled in a small iron stove, and the windows offered a view of the town's rooftops, and beyond them, the dark silhouettes of the surrounding hills. "Breakfast at 7, dinner at 6, she informed him in accented but precise English. "Hot water for washing twice daily. If you need anything else, you've only to ask." She hesitated at the doorway, much as Lars had hesitated in the sledge. "You're here about the old mines, I understand?" "Indeed. The consortium is interested in the possibility of reopening some of the deeper workings." Astrid's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Concern, perhaps. Or something deeper. "I see. Well, you'll find no shortage of people willing to share their opinions on that subject, though you might find the opinions varied." After she left, Björn unpacked his belongings and spread out the preliminary maps and surveys that the consortium had provided. The documents painted a picture of a mining operation that had been quite extensive in its heyday, with shafts extending deep into the bedrock following copper veins that branched and twisted in complex patterns. The deeper workings, though sealed, after the 1888 incident, were marked in red ink with notations that struck him as oddly vague for engineering documents. Section 7 deep, permanently sealed due to geological instability. Levels 8-12, Access restricted pending safety assessment. Lower excavations. Discontinued due to operational difficulties. Operational difficulties. In Björn's experience, that term usually meant something more specific: flooding, gas emissions, structural collapse, or equipment failures. The vagueness of the terminology suggested either poor record-keeping or a deliberate obfuscation of the actual problems encountered. He made notes in his leather-bound journal, questions to investigate once he began his survey work. The rational part of his mind, the part trained in geological survey and mining engineering, suggested that the difficulties were probably routine, perhaps unusual flooding or unstable rock formations that had made extraction uneconomical. With the technology of the 1880s, modern techniques might well make these same deposits viable again. But as he worked by lamplight, occasionally glancing up at the frost-covered windows where the aurora borealis painted shifting curtains of green and gold across the star-filled sky, Björn found his thoughts returning to the subtle fears he had detected in both Lars and Astrid. There was something about their carefully neutral responses, their hesitations and half-finished sentences, that suggested knowledge they were reluctant to share. A soft knock at his door interrupted his review of the documents. Astrid stood in the hallway, carrying a tray with a steaming mug and a plate of dark bread and cheese. "Thought you might appreciate something warm before sleep," she said, setting the tray on his small table. "The nights can be restless here, especially for newcomers." "That's very kind of you." Björn gestured towards the map spread across his bed. "I don't suppose you know anything about the mining operations? Your family has been in Roros long?" "My husband's family came here in the 1850s. Miners mostly, though Niels himself works the newer shafts." She seemed to consider her words carefully. "The old-timers, they have stories about the deep workings. Probably nothing that would interest an educated man such as yourself. Actually, local knowledge can be quite valuable. Sometimes the practical experience of working miners reveals geological features that don't show up in formal surveys." Astrid moved to the window, gazing out at the aurora-lit landscape. "They say the old Norse settlers found something down there, something that made them carve protective runes into the stone. Probably just superstition, but—" She turned back to face him. 17 men went down in 1888 and never came back up. That's not superstition. That's fact. The records suggest a tunnel collapse. The records suggest many things." Her tone was carefully neutral. "But the men who worked alongside those 17, they told different stories. Stories about sounds in the deep tunnels, about chambers that extended further than any man had dug them, about discoveries that troubled the mind." Björn set down his pen, giving her his full attention. "What kind of discoveries?" "Ancient timbers, carved with symbols that predated the mine by centuries, stone passages that seemed to connect with natural caverns, and sounds, Mr. Eriksson. Sounds that seemed almost like music, almost like singing, but not quite human." She paused, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders, despite the warmth of the room. The miners who came back up refused to go down again. Strong men. Men who had worked the depths for decades, suddenly afraid of their own workplace. "Fear can spread quickly in isolated communities," Björn observed, though he found himself intrigued despite his rational skepticism. "Especially when tragedy strikes. Perhaps. Or perhaps some fears are worth heeding." Astrid moved towards the door. "Sleep well, Mr. Eriksson. Tomorrow you'll begin to form your own opinions about what lies beneath Roros." After she left, Björn found himself staring at the maps with new interest. If the miners had indeed discovered pre-existing passages or caverns, that could significantly complicate any excavation efforts. Natural caves often contained unpredictable water flows, unstable formations, or dangerous gases. Such discoveries might well constitute the operational difficulties that had led to the sealing of the deeper workings. Yet something in Astrid's manner suggested that the reality was more complex than simple geological hazards. The way she had spoken of the sounds, of discoveries that troubled the mind, hinted at something beyond the usual concerns of mining, engineering. Outside his window, the aurora borealis continued its silent dance across the northern sky, sheets of green and gold light that seemed to pulse with an almost organic rhythm. In the distance, just visible as dark shapes against the starlit snow, the sealed entrances to the old mine workings stood like broken teeth in the earth's surface. As Björn prepared for sleep, extinguishing his lamp and settling beneath the heavy wool blankets, he found his mind returning to Astrid's words. The wind outside seemed to carry faint sounds, perhaps just the settling of timber buildings in the cold, or the distant howl of Arctic wolves, but almost musical in their pattern, almost like voices calling from a great distance. He told himself it was simply the effect of a long journey and an unfamiliar environment, but as sleep finally claimed him, his dreams were filled with the sound of pickaxes striking stone in rhythmic patterns that seemed less like work and more like some ancient, repetitive ritual being performed in the darkness far below. The morning sun, pale and distant through the Arctic air, cast long shadows across the mining complex as Björn made his first official survey of the Roros workings. He had risen early, consumed a breakfast of dark bread, butter, and strong coffee under Astrid's watchful eye, and then made his way through the town's quiet streets to the administrative offices of the mining consortium. The building was a substantial, stone structure that spoke to the wealth the copper mines had once generated. Inside, he was greeted by Henrik Svensson, the current operations manager, a man in his late 50s whose weathered hands and careful movements marked him as someone who had worked his way up from the mining floor rather than learned his trade from books. "Welcome to Roros, Mr. Eriksson," Henrik said, leading him to an office that smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. "I trust your accommodation is satisfactory." "Quite comfortable, thank you. I'm eager to begin my assessment of the sealed workings." Henrik's expression grew guarded. "Of course, though I should mention that access to some areas may be challenging. The lower levels have been sealed for 35 years now, and the supporting infrastructure has deteriorated considerably." They spread out detailed maps of the mine complex across Henrik's desk, and Björn began to appreciate the true scope of the workings. The surface installations were merely the visible portion of an underground labyrinth that extended deep into the bedrock, following copper veins in a complex network of tunnels, chambers, and vertical shafts. "The profitable extraction ended here," Henrik explained, pointing to markings that indicated the depth of current operations. "Below that, you have the old workings, 7 additional levels that were excavated between 1650 and 1888. Good copper down there, according to the old records, but the extraction became problematic." "Problematic how?" Henrik was quiet for a moment, his finger tracing the boundaries of the sealed sections. "Officially, geological instability. The supporting timbers began to fail, and there were concerns about potential collapse. The decision was made to concentrate on the upper workings where extraction could proceed more safely. And unofficially?" "Unofficially." Henrik glanced towards the door as if ensuring their privacy. "The men refused to work down there. It started gradually, workers requesting assignments to different sections, complaints about unusual conditions in the deep tunnels. But after the 17 went missing, that was the end of it. No one would go down." Björn studied the maps more closely. The sealed sections formed an extensive network beneath the currently active workings, with passages that seemed to extend well beyond the boundaries of the known copper deposits. Some tunnels appeared to connect with natural features, underground streams perhaps, or cave systems that had existed long before human excavation began. "These passages here," he said, indicating a series of tunnels that branched off from the main workings. "They seem to extend beyond the mining area proper." "Aye. The miners called them the old ways. They claimed some of those passages existed before the mine was opened, that they'd been carved by someone else entirely." Henrik's tone suggested skepticism, but his expression remained troubled. "Norwegian miners are practical men, Mr. Eriksson, not given to flights of fancy. When they started talking about ancient carvings and sounds in the darkness, management took notice. I'd like to examine the sealed entrances if possible. I can show you the main access points, but understand, these have been sealed with stone and mortar, not just blocked with timber. The intention was to make them permanently inaccessible." They spent the morning touring the active portions of the mine, and Björn was impressed by the scope and organization of the operation. The upper workings were well maintained, with proper ventilation, sturdy timber supports, and the efficient movement of ore carts along well-established routes. The miners, he observed, worked with the steady competence of men who knew their trade, but he noticed that none ventured close to the areas where passages led downward to the sealed levels. The men seemed to avoid certain sections, he observed as they walked through a main tunnel. Old habits. Some of the miners are sons and grandsons of men who worked here during the Troubles. Stories get passed down, and superstitions die hard in communities like this. By afternoon, Henrik led him to the sealed entrances themselves. The sight was more impressive than Björn had expected. Each access point had been blocked with carefully fitted stones, mortared so solidly that the barriers looked almost ancient, as if they had been part of the original rock formation. Iron plates had been bolted over the stonework, and these bore runic symbols that Björn assumed were some form of official marking or warning. Thorough work, he observed, running his hand along the stonework. Almost as if you were sealing a tomb, rather than closing off a mine section. The men who did the work insisted on it being done properly, said they wanted to make sure nothing would, well, that the seal would hold. Henrik's voice carried an odd note. The symbols were added at the request of some of the older miners. Local tradition, they claimed. Björn examined the runic markings more closely. They appeared to be authentic Old Norse symbols, carved with considerable skill into the iron plates. His knowledge of runic writing was limited, but he recognized some of the characters, symbols associated with protection, binding, and warding off evil influences. These aren't simply decorative, are they? No. The men who survived the 1888 incident, they insisted these were necessary, claimed the symbols would keep whatever was down there from coming up. Henrik shrugged, but the gesture seemed forced. Superstition, of course, but it cost nothing to humor them. As they stood before the sealed entrance, Björn became aware of a subtle sound, so faint it might have been imagination, but persistent enough to capture his attention. It seemed to come from beyond the stonework, a rhythmic tapping that could have been water dripping or settling timbers, but which carried an almost musical quality. "Do you hear that?" Henrik tilted his head, listening. His face grew pale. "Aye, it comes and goes. Been happening for years now. We've told ourselves it's just the old timbers settling, but..." He moved away from the sealed entrance. "Perhaps we should continue the tour elsewhere." That evening, back in his room at the boarding house, Björn compiled his preliminary notes. The engineering challenges of reopening the sealed workings would be considerable but not insurmountable. Modern excavation techniques, improved ventilation systems, and better structural support could address most of the historical problems that had made the deep levels unprofitable. But the human element remained puzzling. The fear he had detected, in Henrik, in Lars, in Astrid, seemed disproportionate to the usual concerns of mining operations. Even accounting for local superstitions and the natural tendency of isolated communities to amplify tragic events into legends, there was something about the way people spoke of the sealed workings that suggested genuine, deep-seated terror. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. He opened the door to find an elderly man in rough work clothes, his face bearing the distinctive pallor of someone who had spent decades working underground. "Mr. Eriksson, I'm Olaf Christensen. I hear you're asking questions about the old workings." "Indeed." "Please, come in." Björn gestured to a chair by the fire. "You worked in the mines?" 43 years, man and boy. Started when I was 14. Worked every level from the surface down to..." He paused, his gnarled hands gripping the arms of his chair. "Down to level 8. That was as deep as anyone went after the Troubles started." "You were there in 1888? Olaf's eyes grew distant. "Aye. I was there the morning the 17 went down for the last time. Good men, all of them. Experienced miners who knew the deep workings better than anyone." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. They'd been working Section 7 deep for weeks, following a new copper vein that seemed richer than anything we'd found before. But there were oddities. What kind of oddities? Ancient timbers, for one thing, thick oak beams that showed. Tool marks unlike anything our carpenters made. Carved symbols too, though none of us could make sense of them. And chambers. natural caves that connected with our tunnels, extending back into the mountain further than our lights could reach. Björn leaned forward, his engineer's mind engaging with the practical implications. Natural caves could explain some of the geological instability. They often contain unpredictable water flows or unstable formations. Perhaps. But it wasn't water we heard coming from those caves. Olaf's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. It was singing, Mr. Eriksson. Not human singing, but something else. Beautiful and terrible at the same time, like the stories the Sami tell of the spirits that live beneath the earth. The miners who disappeared. What exactly happened that morning? They went down as usual, carrying their tools and lanterns, but something was different. They'd been acting strange for days, talking about dreams they'd been having, about voices calling to them from the deep tunnels. That morning, their supervisor tried to keep them on the upper levels, but they insisted on going deeper. Olaf stared into the fire, his weathered features etched with memory and regret. 6 hours later, when they failed to report for the midday break, we sent down a search party. Found their lanterns still burning, arranged in a perfect circle around a stone carving we'd never seen before. But the men, they were gone, vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed them. The official investigation concluded that a tunnel collapse had trapped them. The official investigation concluded what it needed to conclude. Olaf's tone carried a note of bitter irony. But those of us who searched those tunnels, who saw what the 17 had found down there, we knew better. What did they find? Olaf was quiet for so long that Björn wondered if the old man had forgotten the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the crackling of the fire. A chamber, not carved by human hands, but worn smooth by water over centuries. And in the center of that chamber, a pool so deep our weighted lines couldn't find the bottom. The water was perfectly still, perfectly clear. And when you looked into it, he shuddered. When you looked into it, you could see lights moving in the depths. Not reflections, lights that pulsed and shifted like living things. Phosphorescent minerals, perhaps. Certain geological formations can create luminescent effects. Perhaps. But Olaf didn't sound convinced. Though minerals don't usually sing, do they? And they don't reach up through the water to grab hold of a man's mind and pull him down into dreams he can't wake from. The old miner stood to leave, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body had been worn down by decades of hard labor. At the door, he turned back to face Björn. You seem like a good man, Mr. Eriksson, educated and sensible. But education and sense aren't always enough, especially not down there in the dark. If you do go down, and I suspect nothing I say will stop you, remember this. Some discoveries are meant to stay buried. Some doors, once opened, can never be properly closed again. After Olaf left, Björn found himself unable to concentrate on his technical notes. The old miner's story, told with such conviction and obvious distress, painted a picture that his rational mind struggled to accept. Yet the consistency of the accounts, the fear, the references to ancient carvings and mysterious chambers, the persistent sounds from beyond the sealed entrances, suggested that something genuinely unusual had occurred in those deep tunnels. He walked to his window and gazed out at the aurora-lit landscape. In the distance, barely visible against the snow-covered hills, the sealed mine entrances stood like dark wounds in the earth's surface. As he watched, he thought he could see a faint light flickering near one of the entrances, perhaps just a reflection of the aurora on metal or ice, but steady enough to hold his attention. The light pulsed gently, rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. And as he stared at it, Björn found himself thinking about Olaf's description of the lights in the underground pool, lights that moved like living things in the depths of perfectly still water. He told himself it was merely his imagination, influenced by the day's conversations and the strange, ethereal beauty of the northern lights. But as he prepared for bed, Björn found himself listening intently to the night sounds around him. The whisper of wind through the eaves, the settling of timber in the cold, and beneath it all, so faint it might have been the sound of his own heartbeat, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the building. In his dreams that night, he walked through tunnels carved from living stone, following the sound of distant singing towards a light that pulsed like a beacon in the depths of the earth. And when he woke briefly, in the deepest part of the night, he could have sworn he heard the sound of pickaxes striking stone, carried on the wind from the direction of the sealed mines. The third day of Björn's investigation dawned gray and bitter, with snow falling in thick curtains that reduced visibility to mere meters. He had spent the previous evening poring over geological surveys and historical records, seeking rational explanations for the phenomena described by the miners. What he found only deepened the mystery. The geological reports, dating back to the 1870s, mentioned several anomalies in the deeper workings. Compass readings became unreliable below level 6. Temperature measurements showed unexpected variations, with some passages remaining significantly warmer than others, despite being at the same depth. Most intriguing were references to natural acoustic phenomena, echoes and reverberations that seemed to originate from unmapped caverns extending beyond the excavated areas. Henrik arrived at the boarding house shortly after breakfast, bundled in heavy winter clothing and carrying a leather satchel filled with keys, diagrams, and what appeared to be mining equipment from an earlier era. "The weather's taken a turn," he observed, stamping snow from his boots in the entryway. "But if you're determined to examine the sealed areas more closely, today might be our best opportunity. The storm will keep the curious away, and the regular work crews are confined to the upper levels." They made their way through the snow-covered streets to the mining complex, their footsteps muffled by the thick blanket of white that had transformed Roros into a landscape of shadows and suggestion. The administrative buildings seemed almost abandoned in the early morning gloom, their windows dark and their usually busy courtyards empty except for the falling snow. Henrik led him to a storage building near the main mine entrance, where he unlocked a heavy wooden door and gestured Björn inside. The interior was filled with mining equipment from decades past: lanterns, pickaxes, coils of rope, and wooden supports that bore the scars of years spent underground. The air smelled of old leather, metal, and something else, a mineral scent that seemed to speak of great depths and ancient stone. Some of this equipment belonged to the men who worked the deep levels, Henrik explained, selecting several items and placing them in a canvas bag. "Might be useful if we're going to make a proper examination. Are we actually going underground?" "Not into the sealed sections. That would require major excavation work. But there are a few access points that allow us to get close to the barriers, to examine the stonework and assess what would be required to reopen them." Henrik's expression was carefully neutral. "There's also an observation shaft, a narrow passage that runs parallel to some of the sealed tunnels. It was used for ventilation and monitoring purposes. We can descend far enough to get a sense of conditions below." Björn felt a stirring of anticipation mixed with something else, a feeling he couldn't quite identify but which seemed to grow stronger as they gathered the old mining equipment. "How deep does this observation shaft extend?" "To level 7. About 200 feet down. It doesn't connect directly with the sealed workings, but it runs close enough that you can sometimes hear, well, you can hear the sounds that come from beyond the barriers." They equipped themselves with sturdy lanterns, coils of rope, and the basic safety equipment that any underground exploration required. Henrik also selected a heavy iron bar and a small sledgehammer, tools that seemed more suited to breaking through obstacles than simple observation. "Just in case," he explained when he noticed Björn's questioning look. "Sometimes the old passages become blocked with debris or ice. Best to be prepared." The entrance to the observation shaft was located in a small building separate from the main mining complex. Henrik unlocked a series of heavy doors, each barrier more substantial than the last, until they stood before a narrow opening that descended into the earth at a steep angle. A wooden ladder, reinforced with iron rungs, extended down into darkness that their lantern light could not penetrate. The shaft was carved in 1889, the year after the incident. Henrik explained as they prepared their lanterns. Management wanted a way to monitor the sealed sections without actually reopening them. What they discovered down there? Well, it convinced them that the seals should remain permanent. The descent began slowly, with careful attention to each rung of the ladder. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for a single person, and lined with rough stone that wept moisture in the warmer air from their lanterns. As they moved deeper, the temperature grew noticeably warmer despite the Arctic conditions above ground, and the air took on a mineral taste that seemed to coat the back of the throat. 20 meters down, Henrik called softly, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. You can feel the difference in the air. Something about the deep levels. They maintain their own climate. Björn paused on the ladder, holding his lantern up to examine the stone walls more closely. The rock face showed clear evidence of tool marks, but not all of them appeared to be from the shaft's construction. Older marks, deeper and made with different tools, were visible beneath the more recent excavation work. These older carvings, he called down to Henrik, they predate the shaft? Aye. According to the records, the workers found evidence of earlier excavation almost immediately. The theory was that this area had been worked before, perhaps by early Norse settlers, though, for what purpose no one could say. They continued their descent, and with each meter the sounds from above grew fainter, while new sounds became audible from below. At first it was simply the drip of moisture and the settling of ancient timbers, but gradually Björn became aware of something else. A rhythmic sound that seemed to come from beyond the stone walls themselves. Do you hear that tapping? Henrik paused on the ladder below him. Aye. It's been constant for decades now, regular as clockwork, though it seems to get stronger during certain times of year. What times? Winter mostly, during the darkest months, when the aurora is strongest. Some of the old-timers claim it follows the phases of the moon, but I've never paid close enough attention to confirm it. At 50 meters depth, the shaft opened into a small chamber carved from the living rock. The space was just large enough for 2 men to stand comfortably, with passages extending in 3 directions. Henrik indicated a narrow tunnel that angled downward towards the east. That leads towards the sealed workings. About 30 meters along, it opens into a chamber where you can observe one of the barrier walls. The other passages connect with natural caves, part of an extensive system that extends deep into the mountain. As they moved through the eastern passage, the air grew thicker and took on a metallic taste that reminded Björn of blood. The walls here showed more evidence of ancient tool work, and in several places runic symbols had been carved directly into the stone. Unlike the protective runes on the sealed entrances above, these symbols seemed older, cruder, and somehow more urgent in their execution. These carvings, Björn observed, running his fingers along the rough symbols, they seemed to tell a story. The university sent a scholar to examine them some years back, professor of archaeology from Oslo. He spent 3 days down here making drawings and notes, then left suddenly without explanation. Never published his findings, and refused to answer letters asking about his conclusions. The passage opened into a chamber perhaps 10 meters across, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows beyond their lantern light. At the far end, a massive stone wall blocked what had once been a tunnel entrance. The stonework was the same, careful construction Björn had observed at the surface entrances, but here the runic symbols covered not just iron plates but were carved directly into the stone blocks themselves. More significantly, the rhythmic tapping sound was much stronger. Here, clearly audible as a steady percussion that seemed to come from beyond the stone barrier. As they listened, the sound took on a more complex pattern. Not just single taps, but sequences that almost resembled communication. How long has this sound been ongoing? Henrik set down his lantern and listened intently. Since the ceiling was completed. 35 years of constant noise. We've told ourselves it's settling timbers or flowing water, but he gestured towards the barrier. Water doesn't tap in patterns. Timber doesn't maintain such regular rhythm for decades. Björn approached the stone wall and placed his hand against its surface. The blocks were fitted so precisely that no mortar lines were visible, and the stone itself felt warm to the touch despite the cool air of the chamber. More disturbing, he could feel a faint vibration through the stone. Not just the impact of whatever was creating the tapping sounds, but a deeper tremor that suggested movement in the spaces beyond. Have you ever considered what would happen if these barriers were removed. The question has been raised, but given the history, given what happened to the 17 men who went missing, Henrik shook his head. The consensus has always been that some things are better left undisturbed, as if in response to their conversation, the tapping from beyond the wall suddenly changed pattern. Instead of the steady rhythmic percussion they had been hearing, the sounds became more complex. A series of rapid taps followed by longer pauses, then slower, more deliberate strikes that seemed almost like Morse code. "That's new," Henrik whispered, his face pale in the lantern light. "I've never heard it change pattern before." They stood in silence, listening to the evolving percussion from beyond the stone barrier. The sounds continued for several minutes, growing more complex and seeming to develop a conversational quality, as if something beyond the wall was responding to their presence, trying to communicate across the barrier of stone and runic protection. Then, as suddenly as it had changed, the tapping returned to its original steady rhythm, leaving them standing in the underground chamber with the uncomfortable feeling that they had just participated in some form of dialogue they didn't understand. "We should return to the surface," Henrik said, his voice carefully controlled. "I think you've seen enough to understand why the consortium might want to reconsider any plans for reopening these sections." But as they gathered their equipment and prepared to leave, Björn found himself reluctant to abandon the chamber. The rational part of his mind insisted that the sounds had natural explanations, perhaps underground streams, or the settling of geological formations, or even the effects of atmospheric pressure changes in the complex network of tunnels and caves. Yet something about the way the tapping had responded to their presence, the almost conversational quality of the pattern changes, suggested a level of awareness that purely natural phenomena couldn't explain. "Before we go," he said, setting down his pack and approaching the barrier again, "I'd like to try something." Henrik watched nervously as Björn selected one of the iron tools they had brought and began tapping against the stone wall. 3 short strikes, followed by 3 longer ones, then 3 short strikes again. The simple pattern of the international distress signal, repeated clearly and deliberately. For a moment, silence filled the chamber. Then, from beyond the barrier, came an exact repetition of the pattern. 3 short taps, 3 long, 3 short. The precision was unmistakable, the timing perfect. Henrik stepped backward, his lantern wavering in his trembling hand. "Dear God," he whispered. "It's responding. It's actually responding." Björn tried a different pattern, 5 quick taps followed by a pause. Again, the response was immediate and exact, the same sequence repeated perfectly from beyond the stone wall. "This changes everything," Björn said, his engineer's mind racing through the implications. "If there's something alive down there, something intelligent enough to recognize and repeat communication patterns, then the 17 men might still be alive." Henrik finished, his voice barely audible. "After 35 years, they might still be down there." The thought hung between them in the lantern-lit chamber, both terrible and hopeful in its implications. If the missing miners had somehow survived in the sealed sections, if they were the source of the sounds that had continued for decades, then the barriers weren't keeping something in, they were keeping rescue out. But even as the possibility formed in his mind, Björn felt a deeper unease. The precise repetition of the communication patterns, the immediate and perfect responses, suggested an intelligence that was perhaps too perfect, too inhuman in its exactness. Human survivors, even skilled miners familiar with underground conditions, would likely show some variation in their responses, some deterioration after decades of isolation. What lay beyond the barrier responded with mechanical precision, as if the patterns were being processed and repeated by something that understood the concept of communication, but not its nuance or humanity. As they began their ascent back to the surface, the tapping from below continued, but now it seemed to follow them up the shaft, growing fainter with distance but never quite disappearing. And when they finally emerged into the gray daylight of the winter storm, both men found themselves looking back at the entrance with a mixture of fascination and dread. "What are you going to report to the consortium?" Henrik asked as they secured the shaft entrance. Björn was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "I'm going to recommend a more thorough investigation, if there's any possibility that the missing miners are still alive." We have an obligation to attempt rescue. And if they're not alive? If what we heard down there is something else entirely? Björn had no answer for that question. But as they walked back through the snow-covered streets of Roros, he found himself increasingly certain that he would be returning to the depths beneath the town. The sounds from beyond the barrier, the intelligent responses to his communication attempts, the warmth and vitality that seemed to emanate from the sealed sections, all of it pointed to something active and aware in the darkness below. Whether that something was human or otherwise remained to be discovered. But for the first time since arriving in Roros, Björn felt that he was beginning to understand why 17 men had descended into those tunnels and never returned. There was something down there worth investigating, something that called to the curious and the brave with a voice that spoke in patterns of stone and shadow. That night, as the aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of green and gold, Björn sat by his window and planned his return to the depths. The tapping sounds had followed him back to the boarding house, not audibly but as a rhythm that seemed to pulse in his thoughts, a percussion that matched the beating of his heart and promised answers to questions he had not yet learned to ask. The storm that had blanketed Roros for 3 days finally broke on the 4th morning, leaving the town buried under meters of fresh snow that gleamed like crystallized starlight in the pale winter sun. Björn had spent the intervening time in his room, ostensibly reviewing technical specifications and preparing his preliminary report for the consortium, but increasingly obsessed with the intelligent responses they had received from beyond the sealed barriers. He had attempted to dismiss the incident as coincidence or misinterpretation, but the precision of the communication patterns haunted him. Each repeated sequence had been exact in timing and rhythm, suggesting not just intelligence, but a form of awareness that was both alien and unsettlingly familiar. The more he considered the implications, the more convinced he became that whatever lay beyond the stone barriers was not only alive but actively trying to communicate. Astrid had noticed his distraction during meals, the way his attention seemed focused on sounds only he could hear. She had begun leaving additional portions of food and stronger coffee, as if sustaining his physical strength might help him resist whatever was drawing his mind downward into the depths beneath the town. "You've been dreaming," she observed on the 4th morning, setting down a plate of dark bread and preserved fish. "I can hear you talking in your sleep. Words I don't recognize, but the rhythm. It sounds almost like the old joik, the traditional songs." Björn looked up from his notes, suddenly aware that he had indeed been dreaming of music. Not melodies exactly, but patterns of sound that seemed to carry meaning beyond words. The dreams had grown more vivid each night, filled with images of vast underground chambers and pools of water that reflected lights from impossible depths. "The Sami songs," he said. "You mentioned them before. My grandmother was Sami. She taught me some of the old ways before the church convinced her they were sinful." Astrid sat down across from him, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "The joik aren't just songs. They're supposed to capture the essence of things, the spirit that lives in places and people and animals. Grandmother said some joik were dangerous, that they could call things that shouldn't be called." "What kind of things?" "The spirits that live beneath the ground. The ones the Old Norse feared enough to carve protection runes wherever they went underground." She studied his face carefully. "You've heard something down there, haven't you? Something that's been calling to you." Before Björn could answer, Henrik arrived at the boarding house, his face flushed with cold and excitement. "The weather's cleared enough to attempt a deeper exploration," he announced. "I've been thinking about what we discovered yesterday, about the possibility that the missing miners might still be alive down there." "Henrik," Astrid said, her voice carrying a note of warning, "some discoveries are better left unmade." "With respect, Mrs. Bergman, if there's any chance that 17 men are still alive after 35 years, we have a moral obligation to investigate." Henrik turned to Björn. "I've spoken with some of the older miners, men who worked the deep levels before the sealing. They remember passages that connected with the sealed sections, routes that might give us access without having to break through the main barriers." Björn felt his pulse quicken. The rational part of his mind insisted that human survival for decades in sealed mine tunnels was impossible. but the memory of those precise, intelligent responses to his communication attempts suggested that something was definitely alive in the depths below. What kind of access? Natural cave systems that intersect with the old workings. There's a passage about 2 kilometers outside town, a limestone cave that the Sami used for ceremonies before the Norse arrived. According to the old maps, it connects with the underground stream that flows through the deepest levels of the mine. Astrid stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. The Sami sealed that cave for reasons. Henrik Svensson. There are stories about that place. Warnings passed down through generations. Stories and superstitions, Henrik replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by his own words. But if there's a natural route to the sealed sections, we could investigate without damaging the protective barriers. After Henrik left to gather additional equipment, Astrid remained at the table, staring into her coffee cup with an expression of deep concern. My grandmother told me about that cave, she said quietly. The Sami called it Jabmeib Mu, the gateway to the land of the dead. They said it was a place where the spirits of the earth spoke to those brave enough to listen, but also where the unwary could be drawn so deep into the mountain that they never found their way back to the world of the living. Every culture has stories about dangerous places. Usually they're based on practical concerns, unstable geology, dangerous animals, or simply the risk of getting lost in complex cave systems, perhaps. But my grandmother also said that some of the old Norwegian miners came to the Sami before they sealed the deep levels. They wanted to know the proper rituals for binding something underground, for making sure it couldn't follow them back to the surface. Björn looked up from his notes, suddenly alert. They sought out Sami knowledge about binding rituals? According to grandmother, yes. They described something they had found in the deepest tunnels, something that had been imprisoned there long before the copper mining began. The Sami helped them carve the proper protection runes and taught them how to construct barriers that would hold not just physical forms, but spiritual ones as well. The implications of this information settled over Björn like a cold weight. If the Norwegian miners had indeed discovered something that required spiritual as well as physical containment, then the sealed barriers might not be protecting the surface world from mine collapse or geological instability, but from something far more ancient and dangerous. Yet the intelligent responses to his communication attempts suggested that whatever lay beyond the barriers was not simply a mindless force, but something capable of thought, of recognizing patterns and attempting to establish contact. The contradiction troubled him. How could something that required spiritual imprisonment also be something that responded to communication with what seemed like desperate intelligence? Henrik returned in the early afternoon with a sledge loaded with climbing equipment, additional lanterns, and what appeared to be surveying instruments from the mining consortium's geological department. I've located the cave entrance, he announced. It's partially collapsed, but passable with some careful excavation. The limestone formation should provide stable passage, and according to the old maps, the route is relatively direct. They set out across the snow-covered landscape as the short winter day began to fade towards evening. The cave was located in a small valley about 3 kilometers from town, hidden among a cluster of ancient pine trees that had somehow survived centuries of harsh weather and human activity. The entrance was indeed partially collapsed, but Henrik had brought tools for moving the fallen stones. As they worked to clear the passage, Björn became aware of the profound silence that surrounded them. No wind stirred the pine boughs. No bird calls echoed from the surrounding forest. Even their own voices seemed muffled, as if the very air was reluctant to carry sound in this place. The Sami markers, Henrik pointed out, indicating carved symbols on several of the larger stones near the cave entrance. These are much older than the runic inscriptions at the mine. The symbols were indeed different from the Norse runes, more organic in their form, resembling stylized animals and natural features rather than the angular characters of the younger alphabet. Some appeared to show figures descending into the earth, while others depicted what might have been underground waters or caves extending deep into darkness. Warning markers, Björn suggested. Possibly, or they might be instructional, showing the proper way to approach whatever lies beneath. Henrik selected a large stone and began working to shift it aside. The Sami relationship with underground spaces was complex. They feared certain places but also considered some caves to be sacred portals to spiritual realms. As the entrance cleared, they could feel air moving from within the cave. Not the stale atmosphere one might expect from a sealed space, but a current that suggested extensive passages extending deep into the mountain. The air carried scents that seemed almost oceanic, salt and minerals, and something else that reminded Björn of deep water under moonlight. The cave system must be more extensive than the maps suggest, he observed, testing the air quality with a small flame. The flame burned clearly, indicating adequate oxygen, but flickered strangely as if the air currents were moving in complex patterns. They lit their lanterns and began the descent into the cave system. The initial passage was narrow but well-formed, carved by centuries of water flow through the limestone bedrock. The walls showed clear evidence of human modification, handholds carved into the stone, level areas that might have served as resting places, and more of the organic Sami symbols that seemed to mark significant points along the route. This was definitely used as a regular pathway, Henrik observed, running his hand along the worked stone. Though whether by the Sami or by earlier peoples is difficult to say. As they moved deeper, the passage began to open into larger chambers, connected by narrow tunnels that required careful navigation. The limestone formations were spectacular, flowstone cascades and crystalline deposits that caught their lantern light and threw it back in complex patterns that seemed almost alive in their movement. But it was the sounds that gradually commanded their attention. At first simply the drip of moisture and the whisper of air currents, but slowly resolving into something more structured, a rhythmic pattern that seemed to emanate from the deepest parts of the cave system. The same tapping we heard at the mine, Björn said, pausing to listen more carefully. But louder here, more complex. Henrik held up his hand for silence. Listen, it's not just percussion. There's almost a melodic quality to it. They continued their descent, following the natural contours of the cave system as it wound deeper into the mountain. The air grew warmer despite their distance from the surface, and the mineral scents became stronger, not unpleasant, but increasingly noticeable. At a depth Björn estimated to be nearly 100 meters below the surface, the passage opened into a vast chamber that their lantern light could not fully illuminate. The ceiling disappeared into shadows above them, and the chamber extended in multiple directions with passages branching off like the spokes of a wheel. But most significantly, they could now clearly hear the source of the rhythmic sounds, not tapping on stone, but something that sounded unmistakably like human voices, singing in harmony. The melody was unlike anything Björn had ever heard, with intervals and progressions that seemed to bypass the ear and resonate directly in the bones and blood. The 17 miners, Henrik whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant singing. They're alive. After 35 years, they're still alive down there. Yet even as the hope formed in their minds, both men felt a deeper unease. The singing was too perfect, too sustained, too inhuman in its precision. It continued without pause for breath, without variation in volume or pitch, as if it were being performed by voices that no longer required air or rest. Following the sound, they selected a passage that angled downward towards what appeared to be the deepest part of the cave system. The walls here showed more evidence of human modification, but the tool marks were unlike anything from Norwegian or Sami craftsmanship. The stone had been shaped with techniques that created surfaces so smooth they seemed almost organic, flowing like water frozen in stone. This work predates any known settlement in the region, Björn observed, running his hand along the impossibly smooth stone. The techniques required to achieve this level of precision. Look at this, Henrik called from further ahead. He was standing before what appeared to be carved panels set into the cave wall. Not random symbols, but organized scenes that told a clear story in sequential images. The panels showed figures descending into underground spaces, discovering vast chambers filled with what appeared to be water, and then transformation. The later panels depicted the same figures, but changed, their forms elongated, their features simplified, their postures suggesting a transition from human to something else entirely. A record, Björn said, studying the carved narrative. Someone recorded what happened to people who came down here, or a warning about what would happen to anyone who followed the same path. The singing grew louder as they continued deeper, and now they could distinguish individual voices within the harmony. 17 distinct vocal lines weaving together in patterns that seemed to contain mathematical precision beyond human capability. The sound drew them forward with an almost magnetic attraction, promising answers to questions they had not yet learned to ask. The passage began to show signs of moisture, not the casual dampness of most cave systems, but active water flow that had carved smooth channels in the stone. Following these channels, they descended further until they reached a point where the passage opened onto what appeared to be an underground shoreline. Before them stretched a body of water so vast that their lantern light could not reach the far shore. The surface was perfectly still, mirror smooth, reflecting their lights with such clarity that it created the illusion of descending into an infinite space filled with floating stars. And from the center of this underground sea, the singing continued. 17 voices in perfect harmony, calling to them across the dark water with a melody that seemed to promise reunion, understanding, and a peace that transcended the boundaries of human experience. "We found them," Henrik whispered, his voice filled with wonder and growing dread. "We found the 17. But as they stood on the limestone shore, gazing out at the impossibly vast underground sea, both men began to understand that what they had found was not rescue, but invitation. A call to join whatever the missing miners had become in the depths, beneath Roros, where time flowed differently and human voices could sustain perfect harmony for decades without pause or variation. The singing continued, beautiful and terrible in its perfection, as the lights they had mistaken for reflections began to move beneath the surface of the dark water, rising slowly towards the shore where two living men stood at the boundary between the world they knew and depths that promised transformation beyond imagination. The underground sea stretched before them like a mirror made of liquid obsidian, its surface so perfectly still that it seemed less like water and more like a portal into another dimension. The singing that rose from its depths had grown more complex as they approached, and now Björn could distinguish not just 17 voices, but harmonies within harmonies, as if each singer had multiplied into multiple vocal lines that wove together in patterns that hurt the mind to follow. Henrik stood transfixed at the water's edge, his lantern trembling in his hand as he stared out at the lights that moved beneath the surface. "They're down there," he whispered. "The 17. They're still singing after all these years." But Björn felt a growing unease as he studied the phenomenon more carefully. The voices were too perfect, too sustained, showing none of the natural variations that human singers would display even in the most practiced choirs. There were no pauses for breath, no slight variations in pitch or timing, no evidence of fatigue or strain. The singing continued with mechanical precision that suggested something beyond human vocal capability. "Henrik," he said quietly, not wanting to disturb whatever delicate balance existed in this place. "When did the 17 disappear?" "December 1888. They went down on the morning of the winter solstice and never came back up. 35 years ago. Do you truly believe human beings could survive that long in an underground environment without supplies, without contact with the surface?" Henrik's expression grew troubled as the implications sank in. "Then what are we hearing? What are those lights beneath the water?" Before Björn could answer, the singing changed. The perfect harmony fractured into individual voices, and for the first time they could distinguish words, Norwegian phrases sung in dialect that dated back to the previous century. "Come down to us, brothers. The water is warm, the darkness is kind. We have learned such songs, such beautiful songs. Join us in the depths where time has no meaning." The voices were recognizably human in origin, but there was something wrong with them, a quality that suggested the speakers were underwater, or speaking through some medium denser than air. The words echoed strangely, arriving at their ears, with delays and distortions that created an unsettling sense of distance despite the apparent proximity of the singers. "They're calling to us," Henrik said, and Björn noticed that his friend had begun moving closer to the water's edge. "They want us to join them." Henrik stopped. Björn reached out and grasped the other man's arm. "Think about what you're saying. Those voices, they don't sound like living men." But Henrik seemed not to hear him. His eyes were fixed on the lights moving beneath the surface, and his expression had taken on the dreamy quality of someone under deep hypnosis. "The water looked so warm," he murmured, "and listen to the harmony. Have you ever heard anything so beautiful?" The singing grew more insistent, and now individual voices began to separate from the chorus, each one calling out what seemed to be personal invitations. "Henrik, my friend, I remember you from the surface. Björn Eriksson, engineer of the deep places, we have such wonders to show you. The copper was just the beginning. We have found veins of gold, of silver, of metals that have no names. Come down and see what we have built in the darkness." The fact that the voices knew their names sent a chill through Björn's rational mind, but Henrik seemed to find it reassuring. "They remember us," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "After all these years, they remember their friends from the surface." Björn studied the underground sea more carefully, trying to understand what he was actually observing. The water was indeed unnaturally warm. He could feel heat radiating from its surface despite the cool air of the cave. More disturbing, the lights beneath the surface were moving in organized patterns, rising and falling in formations that suggested intelligence and purpose. "Henrik, look at the water itself. Really look at it. Does it seem normal to you?" For a moment, Henrik's hypnotic focus wavered, and he examined the underground sea with something approaching his usual analytical mind. "It's too warm for groundwater at this depth, and too clear. I can see the lights moving far below the surface, but water usually becomes opaque after a few meters. And the surface tension. Look how perfectly still it is, even with air currents moving through the chamber." As they observed more carefully, other anomalies became apparent. The water reflected their lantern light with unusual brilliance, as if it contained some luminescent quality of its own. More unsettling, the reflections seemed to show not just their own images but additional figures, shadowy forms standing behind them, reaching towards the water with expressions of longing, an invitation. "We're not alone down here," Björn said, trying to keep his voice calm as he noticed the reflected figures growing more distinct. "There are others, things that want us to enter the water." But the singing was growing stronger, more compelling, and Henrik's attention was being drawn back to the lights beneath the surface. "They're showing us something," he said, pointing to a formation of lights that had arranged themselves into recognizable patterns. "Look, it's a map of the mine workings, but extending much deeper than any human excavation. The lights beneath, the water had indeed formed into a complex diagram that resembled the Roros mine complex, but vastly expanded. The familiar upper levels were there, but below them extended a network of passages and chambers that dwarfed anything shown on the official surveys. At the deepest level, the lights formed a pattern that suggested a vast central chamber with passages radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. "An underground city," Henrik whispered, his voice filled with awe. "They've built an entire city in the depths beneath the mountain." The singing grew more urgent, more insistent, and now the lights began to move upward through the water towards the surface. As they approached, Björn could see that they were not simple luminescent phenomena, but complex forms that retained recognizable human characteristics while being transformed into something else entirely. The first figure to break the surface was clearly one of the missing miners. Björn could recognize the work clothes, the physical build, even facial features that had been preserved despite decades underwater. But the man's skin had taken on a translucent quality that allowed internal light to shine through, and his eyes glowed with the same phosphorescent illumination that emanated from the depths below. "Olsen," Henrik gasped, recognizing one of the missing men. "Erik Olsen. I remember him from when I was a boy, but he looks exactly the same." More figures began to surface, each one clearly recognizable as one of the 17 missing miners, but all transformed in the same way, preserved in their human form, but changed into something that could survive and thrive in the underwater environment. They moved through the water with fluid grace, their glowing eyes fixed on the two living men who stood at the shoreline. "Come join us, brothers." The figure of Eric Olsen sang, his voice carrying clearly across the water despite the fact that his mouth remained submerged. "We have found such peace in the depths, such beautiful music to sing together." The water sustains us, transforms us, makes us part of something greater than human flesh. Another voice added, "You will never hunger, never age, never know loneliness again." Henrik began walking into the water, his movements slow and dreamy, as if he were sleepwalking. "It's warm," he said, wonder in his voice. "So warm and welcoming." Björn grabbed his friend's arm and pulled him back from the water's edge. "Henrik, listen to me. Those things aren't human anymore. They're something else, something that's using the appearance of the missing miners to lure us in." But Henrik struggled against his grip, his eyes fixed on the transformed figures that had begun swimming closer to shore. "You don't understand," he said, his voice taking on the same dreamy quality that characterized the singers in the water. "They're offering us immortality, eternal peace. No more struggle, no more fear." The singers had arranged themselves in a semicircle just offshore, their glowing forms visible beneath the crystal-clear surface. Their song had changed again, becoming more complex and more compelling, with harmonies that seemed to resonate at frequencies that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to deeper parts of the mind. "The engineers who came before understood," one of the voices sang. "The old Norwegian miners who first found this place, they knew the choice we offer. Some chose to seal us away, to deny the gift we bring," another voice added. "But some chose transformation, chose to join us in the eternal song. We have been waiting, singing, keeping the harmony alive for all the lonely years." A third voice sang, "Waiting for the ones who would hear our music and understand its beauty." Björn felt the pull of the singing, the almost magnetic attraction of the underwater lights. But something in his engineer's mind resisted the hypnotic influence. These beings, whatever they had become, were not offering salvation, but assimilation, a dissolution of individual humanity into something collective and eternal, but fundamentally alien. "Henrik," he said urgently, maintaining his grip on his friend's arm. "Remember what Astrid told us about the Sami warnings. Remember the protective runes carved by the miners who escaped. They sealed this place for a reason." But Henrik's resistance was weakening. "The song is so beautiful," he murmured. "And they look so peaceful, so content. No more struggle, no more pain." The transformed miners began to sing more insistently, their voices weaving together in patterns that seemed to create physical pressure in the air around the two surface dwellers. The water began to glow more brightly, and Björn could see that the entire underground sea was alive with movement. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of luminescent forms moving in the depths below. "We are not just the 17 who came from your mine," the voices sang in unison. "We are all who have found this place throughout the centuries. Norse explorers, Sami shamans, Swedish prospectors, Russian traders. All who heard our song and chose transformation over the brief struggle of surface life." Another harmony added, "We are a choir that spans the ages, voices from every culture that has touched these mountains. And we grow stronger with each new voice that joins our eternal song." The revelation that this was not simply a local phenomenon, but something that had been collecting human souls for centuries, sent a shock of understanding through Björn's mind. This was what the old Norse settlers had encountered, what they had feared enough to develop binding rituals and protective runes. This was the source of the Sami warnings, the reason certain caves were considered gateways to the land of the dead. "A trap," he said aloud, his voice cutting through the hypnotic harmony. "You're a trap that's been collecting people for 1,000 years." The singing faltered for just a moment, and in that brief silence Björn heard something else, a sound, like grinding stone or shifting earth that seemed to come from the depths of the underwater city. When the singing resumed, It carried a note of irritation, of hunger that had been acknowledged and was no longer disguised. "We offer eternal life, eternal peace, eternal harmony," the voices sang, but now with an edge of desperation. "What does your surface world offer but struggle and death and loneliness? Join us willingly, and the transformation is gentle, beautiful," another voice added. "Resist, and the water will claim you regardless, but the song you sing will be one of sorrow rather than joy." Henrik was now waist-deep in the water, and Björn could see that his friend's skin was beginning to take on the same translucent quality as the transformed miners. The change was subtle but unmistakable. A luminescence was building beneath Henrik's skin, and his eyes were starting to reflect the underwater lights. "Henrik!" Björn called out desperately. "Fight it! Remember your life on the surface, your family, your work." For a moment, Henrik's expression cleared, and he looked around as if seeing his situation for the first time. "Björn, what? Where am I?" He tried to move back towards shore, but found his legs unresponsive, as if the water itself had become thick and clinging. "The transformation has begun," one of the singers said, its voice now carrying clear satisfaction. "He has accepted our gift. Soon he will join our eternal choir." Björn looked around desperately for something that might break the spell or provide a means of escape. His gaze fell on the carved panels they had observed earlier, the sequential images that showed the transformation process. But now he noticed details he had missed before. Some of the panels showed figures successfully escaping from the underground water, and these panels were marked with symbols that looked like protective runes. "The binding symbols," he said, remembering Astrid's words about the Sami knowledge the old miners had sought. "There's a way to break free." He pulled out his knife and began carving one of the protective runes into the limestone at the water's edge, a symbol he remembered from the sealed mine entrances, one that had been associated with breaking spiritual bonds and preventing unwilling transformation. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The singing became discordant, filled with notes of pain and anger, and the luminescent figures in the water began to retreat from the shoreline. More importantly, Henrik suddenly found himself able to move again, and he began struggling back towards the shore. "The runes work!" Björn called out to him. "The old protective symbols actually work!" But even as Henrik fought his way back to shore, the water around him began to churn with increased activity. The transformed beings were no longer content to wait for willing transformation. They were actively pursuing him, their luminescent forms moving through the water with predatory speed. Björn carved more runes along the shoreline, creating a barrier of protective symbols between the water and the place where Henrik would emerge. The singers' voices rose to a shriek of frustrated rage, and the underground sea began to boil with agitated movement as hundreds of transformed beings pressed against the invisible barrier created by the ancient symbols. Henrik collapsed on the limestone shore, gasping and shaking as the luminescence faded from his skin. "They were in my mind," he whispered. "I could feel them changing my thoughts, making me want to join them. The singing. It was beautiful, but wrong. So terribly wrong." "We need to leave," Björn said, helping his friend to his feet. "Now, before they find a way around the protective barrier." But as they gathered their equipment and prepared to retreat through the cave system, one of the transformed miners spoke with a voice that carried clearly across the water, despite the protective runes. "You cannot escape what you have seen, surface dweller. The song follows those who have heard it, calls to them in their dreams and in their waking hours. We will wait, as we have waited for centuries. The runes may protect you now, but their power fades with time and distance. And when you return, for you will return, drawn by the beauty of our eternal harmony, we will be here, singing, waiting to welcome you home to the depths." The voices faded as Björn and Henrik made their way back through the cave passages, but the echo of the promise followed them. A certainty that this encounter was not an ending, but a beginning, that the choice between surface life and underwater transformation had merely been postponed rather than resolved. As they emerged from the cave system into the gray light of the Norwegian winter, both men found themselves looking back at the entrance with a mixture of relief and inexplicable longing. The rational parts of their minds knew they had escaped a terrible fate, But some deeper part of their consciousness had been touched by the promise of eternal peace and perfect harmony. "What do we tell the consortium?" Henrik asked as they made their way back towards Roros through the snow-covered forest. "The truth," Björn replied, though he suspected the truth would be impossible for anyone to believe. "We tell them that the sealed workings should remain sealed, that some depths are too dangerous to explore." But even as he spoke, Björn knew that the matter was far from settled. The singing had awakened something in his mind, a curiosity about the underwater city and its transformed inhabitants that would not easily be silenced. The protective runes had saved them this time, but the singers were right. Their power would fade with time and distance, and the call of the depths would only grow stronger. As they walked through the darkening forest, both men could still hear the faint echo of the eternal choir, beautiful and terrible in its perfect harmony, singing from the depths beneath Roros where time moved differently and human voices could sustain impossible melodies for decades without rest or variation. The aurora borealis began to dance across the sky as they approached the town, sheets of green and gold light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the distant singing. And in that moment, both men understood that they had not escaped the influence of the depths, but had merely begun a longer, more complex relationship with the forces that dwelt beneath the earth. The choice between surface life and underwater transformation had not been resolved. It had simply been deferred to a future moment when the call of the eternal song would prove too strong to resist, and the protective power of ancient runes would no longer be sufficient to hold back the tide of luminescent transformation that waited in the depths of the underground sea. The return journey to Roros passed in a silence that seemed to press against them like a living thing. Neither man spoke of what they had witnessed in the underground chamber, but the memory of the eternal choir hung between them like a shared fever dream that grew more vivid rather than less as they distanced themselves from its source. Henrik moved with the mechanical precision of a man fighting against his own instincts, each step away from the cave entrance requiring visible effort. Several times he paused and turned back, his eyes searching the darkening forest for the concealed passage that led to the singing waters. Only Björn's firm hand on his shoulder kept him moving forward towards the lights of the town. "I can still hear them," Henrik whispered as they crested the hill that brought Roros into view. "The harmony. It's beautiful, Björn. Why did we leave?" "Because they wanted to change us into something we're not," Björn replied, though his own conviction felt less solid with each passing hour. The rational engineer in him insisted that they had escaped a terrible fate, but a growing part of his consciousness wondered if they had instead fled from a transcendent opportunity. The boarding house felt almost alien after the otherworldly atmosphere of the caves. The warm lamplight, the familiar sense of cooking food and burning wood, the comfortable human proportions of rooms and furniture. All of it seemed suddenly small and limiting after the vast spaces of the underground sea and the promise of transformation into something beyond human constraints. Astrid took one look at their faces and began preparing hot food and strong drink without being asked. "You went to the old cave," she said, not making it a question. "You heard the singing." "How did you know?" Björn asked, settling into a chair by the fire and trying to shake off the persistent chill that seemed to have settled into his bones. "The look in your eyes. I've seen it before, in the men who worked the deep levels before the ceiling. They had the same expression, like they'd seen something beautiful that they couldn't forget, something that made the surface world seem gray and small." Henrik had not spoken since entering the boarding house. He sat staring into the fire, his hands wrapped around a mug of hot coffee, but his attention was clearly focused on sounds only he could hear. Occasionally, his lips would move slightly, as if he were humming along with some distant melody. "How long does it last?" Björn asked. "This effect?" Astrid's expression grew troubled. "For some, it fades after a few days or weeks. They learn to live with the memory, to find satisfaction in surface life again. But for others..." She gestured towards Henrik, who was now swaying slightly in rhythm with his unheard music. "For others, the song becomes stronger over time. They become obsessed with returning to the deep places, with finishing what was started. And what happens to those men? They disappear. Usually during the dark months of winter, when the aurora is strongest and the barrier between worlds grows thin. Their families find empty beds, open doors, footprints leading out into the snow towards the sealed entrances. The implication hung heavy in the warm air of the boarding house. Björn studied Henrik's distant expression and felt a growing certainty that his friend was already lost to the influence of the singing waters, that the luminescent transformation had begun at a level too deep for protective runes to reach. "There must be something that can break the hold completely," he said. "The old miners who helped seal the workings, some of them must have found ways to resist the call. Some did." Astrid moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the room and withdrew a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. "My grandmother kept certain items that the surviving miners brought to the Sami, seeking protection against what they had encountered." She unwrapped the bundle to reveal several objects. Carved bone amulets inscribed with symbols that predated both Norse runes and modern writing, small bags of what appeared to be salt or crystalline powder, and a fragment of metal that gleamed, with an unusual luster despite obvious age. "Protective charms," she explained, "made according to the old ways, blessed with rituals that reach back to the time before the first human settlements in these mountains. Grandmother said they could anchor a person's spirit to the surface world, make it impossible for the deep singers to complete their transformation." Björn examined one of the bone amulets, noting the intricate carving that seemed to shift and flow under his scrutiny. The symbols appeared to represent natural forces, wind, fire, growing things, all aspects of the surface world that stood in opposition to the timeless, unchanging nature of the underwater realm. Would Henrik wear one of these? If he's willing. But the protection only works if it's accepted freely, worn with understanding of what it means. Astrid looked towards Henrik, who continued to sway in rhythm with his private music. "I'm not certain he's capable of such a choice right now." As if hearing his name, Henrik turned towards them, and Björn was shocked by the change in his friend's appearance. In the few hours since their return from the caves, Henrik's eyes had taken on a faintly luminescent quality, and his skin showed the first traces of the translucent pallor they had observed in the transformed miners. "The singing is getting stronger," Henrik said, his voice carrying a dreamy satisfaction. "I can hear individual voices now calling my name, promising such wonderful things. They're preparing a place for me in the choir, teaching me the harmonies. I'll need to know." "Henrik, listen to me," Björn said urgently. "You're being influenced by something alien, something that wants to steal your humanity. Fight it." But Henrik's attention had already drifted back to his private music. He began humming softly, and the melody that emerged was unmistakably the same harmony they had heard rising from the underground sea. The sound filled the boarding house common room with an ethereal beauty that made Björn's heart ache with longing despite his rational understanding of its danger. "He's becoming a conduit," Astrid whispered. "The song is using him to reach out from the depths, to influence others who might hear it." Indeed, Björn could feel the pull of Henrik's humming, the way it awakened the same yearning for transformation that had nearly claimed them both in the underground chamber. The melody promised peace, completion, an end to the struggles and uncertainties of human existence. "Stop him," Björn said, "before the influence spreads." Astrid approached Henrik carefully, holding one of the bone amulets. "Henrik," she said softly, "I want you to wear this. It will help you hear the music more clearly." It was a deception, but one born of necessity. Henrik, in his current state, would resist anything presented as protection against the singing. But the promise of enhanced connection with the underwater choir was irresistible. Henrik accepted the amulet eagerly, placing the leather cord around his neck without examining the carved symbols that covered its surface. The effect was immediate and dramatic. His humming cut off abruptly. His luminescent eyes went wide with shock, and he looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time in hours. Where am I?" he gasped, his hands flying to his throat. "I was singing with them, Björn. I was part of the choir. And now," he shuddered violently, "now I feel so alone, so disconnected." "You're free," Björn said, relief flooding through him. "The amulet is protecting you from their influence." But Henrik's expression suggested that freedom felt more like amputation than liberation. I can barely hear them now, he whispered. Just faint echoes where there used to be such beautiful harmony. How can I live with this silence? The same way humans have always lived, Astrid said gently. With connection to family, friends, community, with purpose found in work and love and the small joys of daily existence. Yet even as she spoke, Björn could see that Henrik was struggling with the transition back to purely human consciousness. The man who had experienced perfect harmony with the eternal choir was having difficulty finding satisfaction in the limited connections available to surface dwellers. The influence isn't completely broken, Björn observed. The amulet suppresses it, but the underlying attraction remains. Yes, those who have heard the deep song are changed permanently. They can choose to resist, to build lives that find meaning, despite the loss, but they will always remember what was offered in the depths. The revelation settled over Björn with uncomfortable weight. He too had heard the singing, had felt its promise of transformation and eternal harmony. The protective amulet might shield him from the worst of the influence, but would he spend the rest of his life feeling the absence of that perfect music, that promise of peace beyond human understanding? As if reading his thoughts, Astrid offered him one of the remaining amulets. The protection is stronger when worn continuously, she said, and the temptation to return to the depths grows stronger with time if left unchecked. Björn accepted the carved bone pendant, feeling its weight settle against his chest like an anchor. Immediately, the persistent echo of the underwater choir that had been growing in his mind faded to barely audible whispers. But with that fading came a sense of loss that was almost overwhelming, as if some essential part of himself had been severed. This is why the miners sealed the deep workings so thoroughly, he said, beginning to understand the full scope of what they had encountered. It wasn't just about preventing access to dangerous areas, it was about protecting future generations from an influence that could destroy human society if it spread. The old ones understood that some discoveries are too dangerous to pursue, Astrid agreed. The promise of transcendence, of escape from human limitations, is seductive, but the price is everything that makes us human. Outside the boarding house, the aurora borealis had begun its nightly dance across the sky, sheets of green and gold light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with distant, unheard music. Watching the lights, Björn found himself wondering how many other places in the world harbored similar phenomena. Underground seas filled with transformed beings who sang eternal harmonies, calling to the living with promises of perfect peace. What happens now? Henrik asked, his voice hollow with loss. Do we simply pretend this never happened? Return to our surface lives and try to forget what we discovered? We do what the Norwegian miners did in 1888. Björn replied. We keep the knowledge contained, we ensure the seals remain strong, and we carry the burden of knowing what lies beneath, so that others don't have to face the same choice. But even as he spoke, Björn knew that the matter was far from settled. The singing waters had marked them both, had awakened a hunger for transformation that protective amulets could suppress but not eliminate. They would spend their remaining years fighting against the call of the depths, resisting the promise of eternal harmony that grew more appealing with each passing day. And somewhere beneath the town of Roros, in chambers filled with luminescent water and transformed beings, the eternal choir continued its perfect song, patient and timeless, waiting for the moment when protective barriers would weaken and new voices would join their underwater symphony. The choice between surface life and deep transformation had been made, but it would need to be made again and again, every day for the rest of their lives, as the memory of perfect harmony slowly wore away at their human satisfaction and called them back to the singing waters where time moved differently, and individual consciousness dissolved into something larger and more beautiful than mortal understanding could contain. The days following their encounter in the depths passed with the strange quality of a fever dream, slowly breaking. Björn found himself dividing his time between the technical requirements of his engineering assessment and a growing obsession with the historical records of Roros, searching for any mention of similar phenomena in the centuries since mining began. What he discovered painted a disturbing pattern. Every few decades, small groups of people had disappeared from the area, sometimes miners, sometimes travelers, sometimes entire families who had ventured too far into the network of caves that honeycombed the mountains. The official records attributed these disappearances to the harsh climate, dangerous terrain, or simple misadventure. But when Björn read between the lines, he began to see references to other explanations. A journal entry from 1794 mentioned voices that call from beneath the stones, singing songs that steal men's minds. A church record from 1823 described the blessing of protective talismans against the spirits that dwell in deep waters. A mining supervisor's report from 1856 noted the strange reluctance of workers to approach certain excavations, claiming to hear music from unmapped passages. The pattern was clear. The underwater choir had been active for centuries, periodically, claiming new voices to add to their eternal song. The sealing of the deep workings in 1888 had not ended the threat, but merely contained it, forcing the transformed beings to wait patiently for new opportunities to expand their influence. Henrik had taken to spending long hours at the boarding house window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape with an expression of profound loss. The protective amulet kept him anchored to human consciousness, but it could not restore the sense of completion he had experienced during his brief connection with the underwater symphony. "I dream of the harmony," he told Björn one evening as they sat by the fire. "Every night I hear echoes of what we left behind. Perfect voices singing in perfect unity, never out of tune, never discordant. How can human music ever satisfy me again after experiencing something so pure?" "Because human music is imperfect," Björn replied, though he struggled with the same sense of loss. "It's full of mistakes and variations and individual interpretation. That's what makes it human, and what makes it ours." But his words felt hollow even as he spoke them. The memory of the underwater choir's perfect harmony made all surface music seem crude and clumsy by comparison. He found himself listening to church hymns and folk songs with growing frustration, hearing every slight variation in pitch, every moment of imperfect timing, as evidence of human inadequacy rather than humanity. It was Astrid who provided the key insight that began to restore their perspective. She had been observing their struggle with the detached wisdom of someone who had seen others face the same challenge. "You're making the mistake of believing perfection is superior to humanity," she said one morning as they picked at their breakfast with the listless appetite of men who had lost their taste for ordinary pleasures. "But perfection is death, gentlemen. It's the end of growth, of change, of possibility." The harmony we heard was unlike anything possible in human music, Henrik protested. "How can imperfection be superior to that?" "Because imperfection allows for improvement, for discovery, for individual expression." Astrid sat down across from them, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "Those singers beneath the water, they've been performing the same perfect song for centuries without variation, without growth, without the possibility of creating something new. They're preserved like insects in amber, beautiful but lifeless." Björn found himself considering this perspective as he continued his research into the historical patterns of disappearances. The underwater choir claimed to offer eternal life and perfect harmony, but at the cost of everything that made existence dynamic and meaningful. The transformed beings were immortal but static, perfect but unchanging, peaceful but ultimately sterile in their endless repetition of the same eternal song. "A trap disguised as paradise," he murmured, understanding beginning to dawn. Exactly. The old Sami understood this. That's why their protection rituals focused not on achieving perfection, but on maintaining connection to the changing world, to the cycles of seasons and growth and renewal. This insight began to restore some measure of peace to both men. They were still marked by their encounter with the depths, still carried the protective amulets that anchored them to human consciousness, but they began to find renewed appreciation for the imperfect beauties of surface life, the way snow fell in random patterns, the way firelight flickered unpredictably, the way human voices carried individual character even when attempting to sing in harmony. But their growing accommodation with their situation was disrupted by a new development. Other people in Roros had begun to display symptoms similar to those Henrik had experienced immediately after their return from the caves. It started with the children. Parents reported that their young ones had begun humming strange melodies. In their sleep, songs with intervals and progressions, unlike anything from Norwegian folk tradition. The children claimed to have learned these songs in dreams, where beautiful voices called to them from beneath the earth. Then several of the miners working the active upper levels began reporting unusual experiences. They heard faint singing echoing from passages that led towards the sealed sections. They found themselves drawn to explore areas they had previously avoided. Most disturbing, they began to experience shared dreams, multiple workers reporting. Identical visions of vast underwater chambers and luminescent beings who promised peace and transformation. The influence is spreading, Astrid observed grimly, as reports of these phenomena reached the boarding house. Something has changed since you visited the underground sea. The barriers that contained the singing are weakening. Björn felt a growing certainty that their exploration had inadvertently damaged the spiritual protections that had kept the underwater choir isolated. By venturing into the depths, by communicating with the transformed beings, they had created a connection that was allowing the influence to spread beyond its traditional boundaries. "We have to return," he said, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "We have to find a way to repair whatever damage we've caused." Henrik looked up from his eternal vigil at the window, his expression mixing hope and terror in equal measure. Return to the singing waters? But the protective amulets will keep us anchored to human consciousness, yes, but they may not be enough if the influence continues to spread. Eventually, the entire town could be affected. The prospect of returning to the underwater chamber filled Björn with conflicting emotions. Part of him, the part that remembered, the perfect harmony and the promise of eternal peace, yearned for another opportunity to join the choir. But the larger part of his consciousness, the part protected by Sami wisdom and ancient understanding, recognized the necessity of containing a threat that could consume not just Roros, but potentially spread to every human settlement within reach of the underground waterways. "There are others who might help," Astrid said. "Sami elders who still remember the old rituals. Norwegian families whose ancestors helped with the original sealing. This was never meant to be faced by individuals. It requires community knowledge and community action." Over the following days, word spread quietly through the network of families and communities that had inherited knowledge of the deep threat. They came to Roros in small groups, Sami herders who brought traditional protective items, descendants of the miners who had survived the 1888 encounter, church officials who carried records of blessing rituals that predated Christian conversion. What emerged was a picture of a threat that had been contained through the combined efforts of multiple cultures and traditions, each contributing their own understanding of how to resist spiritual influence and maintain barriers against transformation. The Norwegian miners had provided technical knowledge and physical labor. The Sami had contributed spiritual protection and binding rituals, and the church had added layers of blessing and consecration that strengthened the overall containment. "The sealing was never just about stonework and mortar," explained Eric Sambi, an elderly Sami elder who had made the journey from his winter settlement specifically to help address the crisis. "It was about creating multiple layers of protection, physical, spiritual, and cultural, that would hold the deep singers in check. And our exploration damaged those protections, disturbed them certainly. The barriers were designed to prevent contact, not to contain something that had already been contacted and acknowledged." Eric studied the protective amulets that Björn and Henrik wore. "These are emergency measures, meant to protect individuals who have been exposed. But they don't repair the larger containment." The assembled group began planning a return expedition, but one very different from Björn and Henrik's initial exploration. This would be a ritual undertaking, protected by traditions that had developed over centuries of dealing with supernatural threats. The goal would not be investigation or communication, but reinforcement of the barriers that kept the underwater choir contained. "You understand," Eric warned them, "that this will require you to resist the full strength of their influence. They will know what you're attempting, and they will use every means at their disposal to prevent the restoration of the barriers." Björn nodded, understanding that they were about to face a test far more dangerous than their initial encounter. The underwater choir had marked them both, had established connections that made them vulnerable to influence and manipulation. Returning to the depths would be like walking into the heart of a spiritual storm, protected only by ancient knowledge and the hope that human will could prove stronger than the promise of perfect transformation. As they prepared for the expedition, the aurora borealis grew more active in the sky above Roros, dancing in patterns that seemed to mirror the rhythm of distant, unheard music. And in the sealed mine entrances, locals reported hearing sounds more complex than the usual tapping. What sounded like hundreds of voices singing in harmony, calling out across the barriers with increasing urgency and desperation. The underwater choir knew that their period of passive waiting was coming to an end. The barriers that had contained them for 35 years were weakening, and soon they would face either expanded freedom to influence the surface world or renewed imprisonment that might last for centuries more. The stage was set for a confrontation between human determination and supernatural influence, between the messy vitality of mortal existence and the perfect stillness of eternal transformation. And in the depths beneath Roros, in chambers filled with luminescent water and transformed beings, the eternal song continued with growing intensity, beautiful and terrible in its promise of peace beyond human understanding. The expedition that assembled in the pre-dawn darkness of a February morning bore little resemblance to the casual exploration that had first brought Björn and Henrik into contact with the underwater choir. This was a formal undertaking, protected by rituals that traced their origins back through centuries of accumulated wisdom about spiritual dangers and supernatural containment. Erik Zombie had brought 3 other Sami elders, each carrying traditional items that had been blessed according to the old ways. Carved antler staffs, bundles of Arctic herbs, small drums whose rhythms were said to counter spiritual influence. The Norwegian contingent included descendants of the miners who had participated in the original sealing, each family contributing knowledge that had been carefully preserved through oral tradition. Most significantly, Father Anderson from the Roros Church had agreed to participate, bringing with him ecclesiastical items that represented the Christian contribution to the containment rituals. The wooden cross he carried had been carved from timber taken from the original mine supports, and it bore runic inscriptions that predated the church's arrival in the region. The Old Norse understood that some threats required more than one tradition to contain, he explained to Björn as they prepared their equipment. The church learned to work with existing protections rather than replace them entirely. The protective measures they employed were far more extensive than the simple amulets that had shielded Björn and Henrik during their initial exposure. Each member of the expedition wore multiple layers of protection, bone carvings that anchored them to the surface world, metal talismans that deflected spiritual influence, and sachets of mineral powders that were said to interfere with transformation. The goal, Erik explained as they made their way through the snow-covered forest towards the cave entrance, is not to destroy the underwater choir. That would be both impossible and potentially dangerous. Destroying them might release their accumulated spiritual energy in unpredictable ways. Then what exactly are we attempting to accomplish? Reinforcement of the existing barriers. The original containment was designed to be self-maintaining, but exposure to the surface world has weakened its spiritual components. We need to restore the binding rituals and strengthen the physical seals. The cave entrance, when they reached it, showed signs of increased activity. The stone markers that Björn and Henrik had moved aside during their exploration had been rearranged into patterns that seemed deliberately symbolic, and fresh carvings had appeared on several of the larger rocks, symbols that Erik identified as attempts by the underwater choir to weaken the cave's natural protective properties. They're trying to establish a stronger connection to the surface, he observed grimly. If we had waited much longer, they might have succeeded in creating a permanent pathway. The descent into the cave system proceeded slowly, with frequent pauses for protective rituals and careful examination of any changes since the previous expedition. The limestone passages showed clear evidence of increased water flow, and the mineral scents were stronger, suggesting that the underground sea had risen or expanded since Björn and Henrik's initial visit. More disturbing were the sounds that echoed through the passages, not just the expected singing from the depths, but new voices that seemed to carry recent Norwegian phrases and expressions. The underwater choir was no longer content with their ancient membership. They were actively incorporating elements from the surface world they had contacted. Listen, Henrik whispered as they paused at a junction of passages. "That voice. It's using words I said during our first visit. They're mimicking our speech patterns." Indeed, among the ethereal harmonies rising from the depths, they could distinguish fragments of conversation in Henrik's voice, phrases about the beauty of the singing, expressions of wonder and longing, words of invitation directed towards the surface world. The underwater choir was using their own recorded speech against them, creating a more compelling call to transformation. Eric began a low chanting in the Sami language, words that seemed to interfere with the mimicked voices and restore some measure of clarity to the air around them. "They learn from contact," he explained. "Each visitor provides them with new tools for influence. That's why the original containment required complete isolation." As they descended deeper into the cave system, the protective rituals became more complex and more frequent. At key points along the route, the expedition paused to perform ceremonies that combined Sami tradition, Norwegian folk practices, and Christian blessing, layered protections that addressed different aspects of the spiritual threat they faced. The underground sea, when they finally reached it, had undergone dramatic changes since Björn and Henrik's first visit. The water level had risen significantly, and the perfectly still surface now showed ripples and currents that suggested active movement in the depths below. More ominously, the luminescent beings were no longer content to remain submerged. Dozens of transformed figures stood waist-deep in the water near the shoreline, their glowing forms clearly visible in the darkness of the vast chamber. "Welcome back, surface dwellers," one of the figures called out, and Björn recognized the voice as that of Erik Olsen, the miner Henrik had identified during their previous visit. But now the voice carried additional tones and harmonics, as if multiple speakers were coordinating to create a single vocal effect. "We have been preparing for your return," the figure continued, and now other voices joined in from across the water, not the chaotic babble of a crowd, but a carefully orchestrated chorus that spoke in perfect unison. "We have learned much from our brief contact with your world. We understand now how to make our invitation more compelling." The expedition members instinctively moved closer together, their various protective items creating an overlapping field of spiritual defense. But even through multiple layers of protection, the influence of the underwater choir was noticeably stronger than during Björn and Henrik's previous visit. "They've been feeding on the connection we established," Erik Zombie murmured, his weathered face grim with concern. "Growing stronger, learning to project their influence more effectively." Father Anderson began a Latin blessing, his voice carrying clearly across the water, but the transformed beings showed no sign of discomfort or retreat. If anything, they seemed intrigued by the religious words, several figures tilting their heads as if analyzing the sounds for useful elements. "Your surface rituals are interesting," the collective voice observed. "We have been incorporating similar elements into our own harmony. Listen." The singing that rose from the depths now included fragments of Latin phrases, snippets of Sami, chanting and Norwegian hymn melodies, all woven together into a complex tapestry that retained its otherworldly beauty while becoming more familiar, more comfortable to human ears. "They're adapting," Björn realized with growing alarm, "learning to use our own cultural elements against us." "That's why we must act quickly," Erik replied, beginning to unpack the ritual implements they had brought for the binding ceremony. "The longer they have to study our protections, the better they become at circumventing them." The Sami elders began arranging their materials in careful patterns along the shoreline: carved bones, polished stones, bundles of dried herbs, and small containers of what appeared to be various powders and oils. Each item was placed according to ancient knowledge about the creation of spiritual barriers and the reinforcement of existing protections. "What we are attempting," Erik explained as he worked, "is not to destroy the underwater choir, but to restore the original containment that kept them isolated from the surface world. The barriers that held them for 35 years can be renewed, but only if we act before their influence spreads too far." The Norwegian families began their own preparations, consulting handwritten notes that recorded the technical details of the physical sealing work their ancestors had performed. They produced iron tools, stone blocks, and mortar ingredients that would be needed to reinforce the connection points where the cave system intersected with the sealed mine workings. The spiritual and physical barriers must be restored simultaneously, explained Olaf Christensen's grandson, a man whose weathered hands showed he had inherited both his grandfather's mining skills and his knowledge of the supernatural threats that lurked in the depths. One without the other will not hold. Father Anderson positioned himself at the center of the group, his carved cross and ecclesiastical items providing a focal point for the combined protective efforts. "In the name of all that is holy and human," he began, his voice carrying formal authority, "we bind what seeks to transform. We contain what seeks to spread. We preserve the boundaries between the world of the living and the realm of eternal song." The effect of the combined ritual was immediate and dramatic. The luminescent figures in the water began to retreat from the shoreline, their glowing forms dimming as the layered protections took effect. More significantly, the water level began to recede, dropping back towards the boundaries it had maintained before Björn and Henrik's initial contact with the depths. But the underwater choir did not retreat passively. As the binding energies grew stronger, their singing became more desperate, more compelling, incorporating every element they had learned from their contact with the surface world. "Brothers, sisters, why do you seek to imprison us again?" the collective voice pleaded, now using the speech patterns and emotional inflections of the expedition members themselves. "We offer you peace, completion, freedom from the struggles and sorrows of mortal existence. Join us willingly, and the transformation will be gentle," other voices added, and Björn recognized some of his own words from their previous visit, now spoken with the perfect harmony and enhanced beauty that the choir brought to everything they touched. Henrik, despite his protective amulet, began to sway in response to the familiar voice patterns. "They're using our own words," he whispered, "making them more beautiful than we ever could." "That's exactly why they must be contained," Eric replied, firmly continuing his ritual preparations despite the growing intensity of the singing. "They take human elements and perfect them, but perfection removes the essential humanity that makes those elements meaningful." The binding ceremony reached its climax as all three traditions, Sami, Norwegian, and Christian, combined their efforts in a complex ritual that addressed multiple aspects of spiritual containment. The Sami elements anchored the barriers to the natural world, the Norwegian components provided technical knowledge about physical sealing, and the Christian blessings added layers of protection that had proven effective against supernatural influence. As the ritual energies peaked, the underground sea began to undergo dramatic changes. The water level dropped rapidly, the luminescent figures retreated towards the deeper sections, and the perfect singing became fainter and more distant. Most importantly, the sense of overwhelming spiritual pressure that had filled the chamber began to dissipate. "The containment is holding," Eric announced with evident relief. "The barriers are being restored." But even as the immediate threat receded, all members of the expedition could feel that something fundamental had changed. The underwater choir had been contained again, but their brief contact with the surface world had left them stronger and more knowledgeable than before. The next time the barriers weakened, and they would weaken again, given enough time, the transformed beings would be better prepared to resist human efforts at containment. "This is not a permanent solution," Father Anderson observed as they gathered their equipment and prepared to leave the underground chamber. "We have bought time, perhaps decades, but the underlying threat remains. Then we must ensure that future generations understand what lies beneath," Björn replied, understanding finally dawning about the true scope of their responsibility. "The knowledge must be preserved, the warnings must be maintained, and the protective traditions must be passed down intact." As they made their way back through the cave system towards the surface, each member of the expedition felt the weight of a secret that would need to be carefully guarded and precisely transmitted. They had faced something that challenged the very foundations of human existence, something that offered transcendence at the cost of humanity itself. The aurora borealis was dancing with unusual intensity when they emerged from the cave, sheets of green and gold light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with residual echoes of the eternal song. But now those echoes were fainter, more distant, contained once again behind barriers that would hold for a while. In the days that followed, the symptoms that had been spreading through Roros began to fade. Children stopped humming strange melodies in their sleep. Miners ceased reporting unusual experiences in the upper workings, and the shared dreams of underwater chambers gradually disappeared from the collective consciousness of the town. But Björn and Henrik, along with the other members of the expedition, would carry the memory of perfect harmony for the rest of their lives. They had chosen to maintain their humanity despite the promise of transformation, but the choice had left them marked, forever aware of what they had given up in favor of preserving the messy, imperfect, gloriously human world above ground. The sealed entrances to the mine workings were reinforced with additional stonework and new protective runes, stronger barriers that would hold against future attempts by the underwater choir to expand their influence. And in the records of the Mining Consortium, Björn filed his final report, a technical document that recommended permanent abandonment of the deeper workings for reasons of geological instability and operational inefficiency. The truth would be preserved in other forms, in Sami oral traditions, in family stories passed down through generations, in church records that spoke carefully of spiritual protections and supernatural containment. But the official world would know only that certain depths were too dangerous to explore, certain places too unstable to exploit. And far below, in chambers filled with slowly receding water and dimming lights, the eternal choir continued their song, patient, timeless, and infinitely beautiful. They would wait, as they had waited for centuries, for the barriers to weaken again, and new voices to join their underwater symphony. The choice between surface life and deep transformation would be offered again, to future generations who would face the same terrible decision that had confronted the 17 miners of 1888 and the expedition of 1923. Some would choose humanity, with all its flaws and limitations, while others would surrender to the promise of perfect harmony in the depths where time moved differently and individual consciousness dissolved into something larger and more beautiful than mortal understanding could contain. The letter arrived on a gray winter morning, delivered by a postal clerk who seemed unusually reluctant to approach the boarding house. Astrid Bergman, now in her 70s but still sharp-eyed and capable, accepted the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, not from age, but from recognition of the handwriting that adorned its surface. Björn Eriksson had returned to Oslo after the events of 1923, resuming his career as a mining engineer with a reputation for exceptional caution regarding underground workings. He had married, raised children, and built a successful practice that specialized in the assessment of abandoned mine sites. But he had never forgotten what lay beneath Roros, and he had never stopped monitoring the subtle signs that might indicate renewed activity in the depths. The letter was brief, but urgent. Dear Mrs. Bergman, I hope this letter finds you well. I write to inform you that certain indicators suggest the barriers established in 1923 may be weakening earlier than anticipated. Mining operations in Sweden have reported phenomena similar to those we encountered. Singing from sealed workings, unexplained disappearances, workers experiencing shared dreams of underwater chambers. More concerning, my youngest daughter has begun humming melodies that I recognize from our time in the depths. When I ask her where she learned these songs, she speaks of beautiful voices that call to her in dreams, promising wonderful things if she will only come to the water. I believe the influence is spreading through underground waterways, reaching beyond the immediate vicinity of Roros. The containment we achieved may have slowed the expansion, but not stopped it entirely. I will be arriving by train on the 15th of February. We must determine whether additional binding rituals are necessary or whether the time has come for more drastic measures. With continued vigilance, Björn Eriksson. Astrid set the letter aside and moved to her window, gazing out at the snow-covered streets of Roros. The town had prospered in the decades since the sealing. Its mining operations focused entirely on the profitable upper workings, while the deeper levels remained permanently closed. Most residents had no knowledge of what lay beneath their feet, living ordinary lives untroubled by supernatural concerns. But a few families maintained the old awareness, passing down knowledge and protective traditions through careful oral instruction. The Sami elders still visited periodically, checking the strength of the spiritual barriers and renewing protective blessings when necessary. And the church continued to hold special services on certain dates, rituals disguised as traditional observations, but actually designed to reinforce the containment of the underwater choir. Yet despite these precautions, Astrid had noticed subtle changes in recent months. Children in the town had begun displaying unusual behaviors, gathering in groups to hum complex harmonies, showing an unexpected fascination with deep water, asking questions about what lay beneath the sealed mine entrances. Most parents dismiss these as normal childhood curiosity, but Astrid recognized the signs of emerging influence. When Björn arrived on the promised date, she was shocked by how much he had aged. The confident engineer of 1923 had become a haunted man, marked by years of carrying knowledge that could not be shared with the ordinary world. His eyes held the same distant quality that she had observed in Henrik during his struggle with the choir's influence, and she suspected that his protective amulet was the only thing keeping him anchored to human consciousness. "It's spreading, isn't it?" she said as they sat by her fire discussing the letter's implications. "The influence is finding new pathways, new ways to reach the surface world. Through the underground water systems, yes. And through the people who have been exposed. We carry traces of their song in our minds, and over time, those traces grow stronger." Björn pulled his protective amulet from beneath his shirt, and Astrid could see that the carved bone had developed hairline cracks. "The traditional protections are failing. What we need is a more permanent solution." "What kind of solution?" Björn was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "The Old Norse settlers faced a similar crisis, according to the archaeological evidence I've been studying. They didn't just contain the underwater choir. They found a way to redirect its influence, channel it into forms that couldn't spread to the surface world." "How?" "Sacrifice. Willing transformation by individuals who chose to join the choir in order to satisfy its hunger for new voices, preventing it from reaching out to claim unwilling participants. The implications of this revelation settled over them like a cold weight. The 17 miners who had disappeared in 1888 had not been victims of supernatural predation, but volunteers who had made the ultimate sacrifice to protect their community from widespread transformation. The choice we thought we were avoiding," Astrid said slowly. "It was never really a choice at all. Someone has to join them to keep them satisfied. Not necessarily, but someone has to be willing to make that choice, to serve as a bridge between the surface world and the depths, a liaison who can negotiate terms that protect both sides." Over the following days, word spread quietly through the network of families who maintained knowledge of the underground threat. The same group that had participated in the 1923 binding ritual reassembled, though many of the original members had been replaced by children and grandchildren who had inherited both the knowledge and the responsibility. Eric Sambi's nephew, now the keeper of Sami traditions, brought disturbing news from the reindeer herding territories. "The Joik are changing," he reported. "Traditional songs that have been sung the same way for generations are developing new harmonies, new intervals that hurt the mind to follow. The singers claim they're improving the music, making it more beautiful, but the changes all follow the same patterns." "The influence is spreading through cultural transmission," Björn realized. "The underwater choir isn't just claiming individuals, it's gradually modifying human music itself, creating conduits for its own expansion." Father Anderson's successor, a younger priest who had been carefully prepared for his supernatural responsibilities, added his own observations. The church records show similar patterns throughout Europe. Isolated incidents of improved music appearing in traditional songs, followed by disappearances and reports of underground singing. Whatever lies beneath Roros is part of a much larger phenomenon. The assembled group faced a terrible realization. The underwater choir was not a local threat, but part of a worldwide network of transformed beings who had been gradually influencing human civilization for centuries. The binding rituals and protective barriers had slowed their expansion, but not stopped it, and now they were adapting their methods to work around traditional defenses. "We need a volunteer," Björn said finally, voicing what everyone had begun to understand. "Someone willing to undergo partial transformation. enough to communicate directly with the underwater choir and negotiate terms for genuine containment. Partial transformation? The young priest asked. Is such a thing possible? The old records suggest it. The original Norse settlers had individuals who served as intermediaries, people who could enter the underwater realm temporarily and return with information about the transformed being's intentions and demands. The role of intermediary was dangerous beyond measure. It required accepting enough of the choir's influence to communicate with them effectively, while maintaining enough human consciousness to return to the surface world with useful information. Most who attempted such contact were either repelled by the protective barriers or lost entirely to transformation. But as the assembled group discussed their options, it became clear that someone would have to make the attempt. The alternative was to watch the underwater choir's influence spread gradually throughout human civilization, transforming music, dreams, and ultimately consciousness itself into something more beautiful, but fundamentally inhuman. Henrik Svensson, who had remained largely silent throughout the discussions, finally spoke. "I'll go," he said simply. "I've been fighting their influence for 25 years. I understand how their power works, and I still carry enough of their song in my mind to serve as a connection point." "Henrik, no," Björn protested. "The risk is too great. You could be lost entirely." "I've been lost for years," Henrik replied with sad acceptance. "Living with protective barriers, fighting against the most beautiful music I've ever heard, trying to find satisfaction in human harmony that sounds crude and clumsy by comparison. This might be my chance to serve a purpose that makes the struggle worthwhile." The decision was not made quickly or easily. The group spent days in discussion, consulting traditional knowledge and exploring every possible alternative. But ultimately, they concluded that Henrik's plan offered the best hope for genuine resolution of the threat. The preparation required weeks of careful ritual work, creating protective measures that would allow Henrik to enter the underwater realm without being immediately transformed while maintaining enough vulnerability to communicate effectively with the choir. The process involved layering traditional protections with new techniques developed specifically for intermediary work. On the night of the spring equinox, when the aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of green and gold that seemed to pulse in rhythm with distant music, Henrik descended once more into the cave system that led to the underground sea. This time he went alone, carrying with him the hopes and fears of everyone who understood what lay at stake. The transformation that followed was unlike anything recorded in the traditional accounts. Instead of complete assimilation into the underwater choir, Henrik achieved a state of dual existence, partially human, partially something else, able to communicate with both worlds while belonging entirely to neither. Through this connection, he was able to negotiate terms that had never been possible before. The underwater choir agreed to limit their influence to specific geographical areas, to cease their attempts to modify human music and dreams, and to accept willing volunteers only from those who made fully informed choices about transformation. In return, they would receive periodic visits from surface dwellers who could share news of the changing world above, preventing the stagnation that came from complete isolation. The transformed beings would also be allowed to contribute to human, artistic endeavors in carefully controlled ways, adding their otherworldly beauty to selected musical and artistic works without compromising human consciousness. The agreement was formalized through rituals that combined elements from multiple traditions, creating binding commitments that both sides could honor without surrendering their essential nature. The underwater choir would remain in the depths, beautiful and eternal, while humanity would continue its messy, imperfect, gloriously dynamic existence on the surface. Henrik became the permanent intermediary, spending his time between both worlds, sometimes walking the streets of Roros as a somewhat changed but recognizably human figure, sometimes swimming in the depths with the transformed choir, translating between two forms of consciousness that had previously been unable to coexist. The arrangement worked, though not without cost. Henrik aged differently than normal humans. His lifespan extended, but his connection to purely human experience gradually attenuated. He remained a bridge between worlds, essential but increasingly isolated, carrying the burden of knowledge that few others could fully comprehend. And in the depths beneath Roros, the eternal choir continued their song. Still beautiful, still compelling, but now contained within boundaries that both sides had agreed to respect. Their music could still be heard by those who knew how to listen, echoing up through the sealed mine entrances on certain nights when the aurora borealis danced overhead and the boundary between worlds grew thin. The town prospered, its residents living ordinary lives while remaining unaware of the supernatural negotiations that had secured their freedom to remain human. Children still played in the snow-covered streets, miners still worked the profitable upper levels, and families still gathered around fires to sing traditional songs that retained their imperfect human beauty. But those who carried the knowledge of what lay beneath, the families who maintained the protective traditions, the church officials who performed disguised containment rituals, the Sami elders who checked the strength of spiritual barriers, they understood that the peace was conditional, dependent on continued vigilance, and the willingness of future generations to honor the agreements that had been made in their name. The choice between surface life and deep transformation would always remain, offered to each generation in new forms and under different circumstances. But now it would be a genuine choice, made with full knowledge of what was being offered and what was being sacrificed, rather than a trap disguised as salvation. And somewhere between the world of the living and the realm of eternal song, Henrik Svensson continued his strange existence, growing old but not entirely human, serving as proof that the boundaries between different forms of consciousness were not absolute barriers but negotiable borders that could be crossed with sufficient understanding and mutual respect. The echo of the underwater choir's perfect harmony would always remain in the world above, beautiful and haunting, calling to those who yearned for transcendence while respecting those who chose to remain gloriously, imperfectly human. And in the depths where time moved differently and individual voices merged into something larger than mortal understanding could contain, the eternal song continued, patient, timeless, and infinitely beautiful, but no longer hungry for unwilling transformation. The cursed mines of Roros had become something else entirely, not a trap or a threat, but a testament to the possibility that even the most fundamental differences in consciousness could be bridged through sacrifice, understanding, and the willingness to honor agreements that transcended the boundaries of individual existence. And so the story ended, not with victory or defeat, but with the kind of complex resolution that characterizes the best of human endeavors. Imperfect, requiring constant maintenance, but ultimately successful in preserving both the beauty of transformation and the essential value of remaining human in a world that offered many different forms of existence.